We recently had an event nearby where we work for Timcast IRL. Tons of people showed up. It was quite awesome. At the event, I was informed by some locals here that it hasn't been the same since the vaccine mandates because living out here in the, Western Maryland and the tri-state, many people like to go to Washington, D.C. as the big city to see events and shows, but you can't anymore because of vaccine mandates. Now, if you're vaccinated and you want to present your papers, by all means you can. And many people are wondering what this means moving forward. It seems that vaccine mandates are a phenomenon of big cities and blue states, not so much the red ones, because we had an event, we played music, we had comedy, we had a bunch of speakers. No vaccine mandates, no mask mandates, just West Virginia. And it wasn't the biggest venue in the world, but it was decently packed, and we had a lot of people show up, all around quite fun. Well, we ask ourselves what the logical conclusion is, and honestly, we don't know. Because it's entirely dependent upon who wins the culture war, which is why the culture war is so important. As you can see, I have a story from New York. NYC workers march across Brooklyn Bridge in protest of COVID vaccine mandate. We can see that even in big blue cities, the Democrat stronghold of New York City, people are saying no to this. But you saw the thumbnail, you saw the title, and you're asking yourself, what is this really about? It's about Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky being one of the most prominent leftists who argued in September that the right response to vaccine mandates is to insist that those who are unvaccinated be isolated from society. Well, Noam Chomsky has doubled, tripled, quadrupled down, this time saying not only should those who are unvaccinated be isolated from society, but when asked, well, how do we get them food? He says, well, actually, that's their problem. You see where this goes. Noam Chomsky, wow. He was asked a couple of years ago about Antifa violence. Should Antifa be engaging in street battles? And he said, in the arena of violence, the most brutal guy wins. And that's not us. And I respected that statement. I also remember Noam Chomsky way back in the day defending free speech, even for those who have bad speech. Thought it was pretty great of him to be consistent in that regard. But now what he is effectively advocating for here, telling all of these leftists, and many of them agree, is that our society should take those who are not vaccinated and effectively imprison them until such time they decide that they will comply with forced medication. Of course, many on the left are saying vaccine mandates have been around forever, which is not true. There have been some vaccine mandates, but the way I describe it on Twitter is I don't recall having to present my medical forms at a bar before. Of course, the argument then gets changed. The goalposts move from right now we are mandating vaccines for, the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, as well as many other vaccines for kids in schools. Yeah, that I understand. I've actually talked about agreeing with. What I didn't agree with was having to show papers to get into a restaurant, being denied public accommodation, not to mention all the creepy exceptions. But of course, the goalposts have to move because this is about culture war tribalism. Well, you may have already figured this one out, but Noam Chomsky, who says food, that's actually their problem, doesn't seem to understand that farmers and truckers are overwhelmingly Trump supporters. And if any group of individuals are going to be defying vaccine mandates, it's going to be Trump supporters, which is also why the NYPD, check this one out, NYPD officer union sues city over vaccine mandate. So by all means, Mr. Noam Chomsky, take away people's food and isolate them. And then ask yourself the real question, how do they get food to you? Because if you isolate them, what you're basically saying is you're going to keep out the truckers, keep out the farmers, and then you won't be eating. The bigger question here, I suppose, is national divorce. In Western Maryland, where I currently am, a letter was submitted to West Virginia. They want to secede from this blue state and join the red state of West Virginia. My friends, saying things are getting spicy is just an understatement. The House voted to hold Steve Bannon in criminal contempt. Noam Chomsky says, lock them up and take away their food. Not so bluntly, but basically. Well, let me show you what he has to say. Before we get into everything, head over to timcast.com, become a member. And you'll get access to exclusive members-only segments on the Timcast IRL podcast, as well as all of our other shows up and coming. We have a new Cast Castle vlog behind the scenes at that event I was just talking about. Going to be a lot of fun. And you'll be supporting our journalists. But don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and take this video, share it with wherever you can. Send it to your friends, post it on Facebook. Don't be annoying about it, I guess. But no, just generally share it. And maybe it will matter to some people. Maybe it'll have an impact. Maybe they'll hear what Noam Chomsky is saying, a prominent leftist, and say, well, I mean, I don't agree with that. Hopefully that's what they say. Because the reality is there are many people tweeting out that Noam Chomsky is right and that we should effectively imprison people and deprive them of food. He goes on to say, well, if they become destitute, treat it like you would a prison. There you go. If you were wondering where we would end up, let me start by simply playing for you this clip and showing you a news story. A news story about people intentionally trying to hurt those who oppose authoritarianism. And I've seen some really interesting tweets about mandates in prisons, and I think a truer statement has never been said. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but someone tweeted, almost every single person would have been a Nazi. And that's true. Almost every single person. You think you're a good person, man, you really don't realize how much they got swept into marching behind that banner. And when you hear stories and things like this, it is true. Many people, the overwhelming majority would have been. I want to play for you this clip from Primo Radical. And we'll start there.
When you talk about folks having the freedom to, separate if they don't want to abide by these vaccine mandates, what would that look like on a practical level? Does that mean that folks need to just stay home and have like groceries delivered to them? Does it mean like separated communities of folks who are unvaccinated, or just, how do you think this would practically play out?
He's referring to this video from September 2nd. The freedom to isolate. I love how they say that, meaning we're kicking you out, denying you access to public accommodation because it's your freedom to do so. Technically, that's true. You have the freedom to leave and say, I will not abide by these things. But then going on to say that we will treat you like you're in prison is pretty much the opposite of freedom.
Same way as with people who say that I don't want to accept traffic rules. I suppose there were people who said it's an attack on my liberty to make me stop at a red light. It's government overreach. We don't want the state to have that power over my private life. Well, such people they should have the decency to remove themselves from the community. If they refuse to do that, then measures have to be taken to safeguard the community from them. Then comes the practical question that you ask, how can we get food to them? Well, that's actually their problem. Of course, if they really become destitute, then yes, you'd have to move in with some measure to secure their survival, just as you do with people in jail, for example. But that's really...
Just as you do with people in jail, for example. Now, that was the quote. It's kind of hard to understand the feeble old crackpot, who I used to be a fan of to a certain degree. Oh, Chomsky. What he said was that measures must be taken to protect the community. What he's really, it's a euphemism, essentially, for rounding up people and isolating them. That's why he said, treat them as if they were in jail, ensure their survival, because you have to. What Mr. Chomsky doesn't realize, unfortunately, is that farmers support Trump. Now, this is the first and most obvious thing I thought of when he said, how do we get food to them? How do we get food to them? Buddy, I don't think you understand how this world works. The real question is, how do they get food to you? That's what I've been talking about this whole time. A trucker from Texas picking up a load. They say, drop it off in New York. And he says, I can't. They have vaccine mandates. Texas doesn't. What about California? Maybe California can drive to New York. And there you go. You get yourself the food. Because the red states aren't going to block the vaccinated. It's only the other way around. But it'll be interesting then when farmers at 85% supporting of Trump say no to this, even if they are vaccinated, and refuse to abide. More importantly, when vaccine mandates as a general rule of policy obstruct people and slow down the process and jam it up because of increased testing and bureaucracy. In which case, when it comes to farmers, I don't know if they'll be selling to you. Now, let's be fair. It's not all about the farmers. California's got a lot of food, all right? And so they'll be able to ship it to certain places. But certainly this means places like New York that restrict people from coming in and getting access to services if they're not vaccinated. Of course, they'll be hurt by this. But the bigger question, I suppose, is truckers. I mean, they're the ones who are going to deliver it. Even if you are from California, will truckers be abiding by the vaccine mandate? I'm going to go ahead and say the answer is probably no. This is from ccjdigital.com. Trucking's political dollars back Trump by a 10-1 margin. This is from last October. Maybe it's different, but they say 10-1. It's comparable to farmers. I think it's fair to say that truckers and farmers overwhelmingly not going to be supporting Joe Biden and Democrats and vaccine mandates. Some will. So ultimately, I'll say this to you, Chomsky, and the leftists who support him, because not every leftist does. Some of them are actively speaking out against it, saying it's authoritarian, it's despotic. When you decide to isolate from the rest of society, then we will have to figure out how to get food to you, not the other way around. And I'm talking not about the unvaxxed. I'm talking about those who are vaccinated or unvaxxed who are simply saying your crackpot rules do not apply. They are unconstitutional. Of course, the left says vaccine mandates have been around for a long time. Oh, I really would love to get into all of that, too, and break down that lie. Is it true that there have been vaccine mandates before? Yes. Have the rules been changed? Yes. Did they lead to unspeakable horrors? Yes. And then people started to say, I really don't think that the ruling from 1904 should apply to the civil rights we enjoy today. But let me show you how far this goes. Because what I really want to talk to you about is the national divorce phenomenon, what it means for where I live, what it means for where you might live. You think it's just Noam Chomsky saying they should have the decency to isolate themselves, and if they don't, we'll take measures. Chomsky is acting under the impression that his tribe, his side, controls all of society. He's wrong. But if you think his insane authoritarian behavior is limited to him, you would be incorrect. From KTLA, driver intentionally rams vaccine mandate protesters in Palmdale. Sheriff's Department. This story just from yesterday evening. A 64-year-old man was arrested Saturday after he drove his Jeep Wrangler into a crowd of people protesting vaccine mandates in Palmdale, injuring one woman, LA County Sheriff's Department officials said. A witness stated a man disagreed with the protest, entered his vehicle, and intentionally drove toward the protesters. Deputy Tina Schrader said in a statement Sunday. The suspect then drove away westbound and out of view. William Aslakson was arrested about 90 minutes after the incident, which occurred about 3:25 p.m. at the intersection of 10th Street West and Rancho Vista Boulevard. He was booked into the Sheriff's Department Palmdale Station on suspicion of felony assault and was being held there Sunday in lieu of $50,000 bail. Inmate records show. He is scheduled to appear Tuesday in Antelope Valley Municipal Court in Lancaster. Now, or is it Lancaster? I don't know. If you're in PA, it's Lancaster. I don't know if he actually got in the car and just full speed rammed people. I really don't think that's the case. I've seen the videos of the Antifa people in the street and the car is just slowly moving through them and they're like, he's hitting us, and they're screaming. If I had to make a guess, he intentionally drove towards them and then probably just honked and wailed and tried to move them out of the way. It could just be that he was upset the road was being blocked, like any other protest. But there are certainly the possibilities that this is a guy, much like Chomsky, who is just foaming at the mouth, insane, seeking to ram through a crowd of people. But let's talk about vaccine mandates. This is from History.com. When the Supreme Court ruled a vaccine could be mandatory. I was listening to Offspring earlier. When I was a kid, they were like my favorite band. And they were very anti-establishment. Today, they are the embodiment of it. Not so much like Rage on Behalf of the Machine, formerly Rage Against the Machine, but the Offspring kicked out their drummer. They fired him because he has Guillain-Barré syndrome and cannot get vaccinated. Apparently, they don't care. Way to stick it to the man, Offspring. Used to be a big fan. Still like some of the older music, but man, not so much. I mean, to be completely honest, Americana, like I like Smash Ixnay and Americana. Those are the albums by them, everything else. But anyway, I back to the news. Let me read to you about vaccine mandates. And then I really do want to talk about national divorce because we got some big news. History.com says, in 1901, a deadly smallpox epidemic tore through the Northeast, prompting the Boston and Cambridge boards of health to order the vaccination of all residents. But some refused to get the shot, claiming the vaccine order violated their personal liberties under the Constitution. One of those holdouts was a Swedish-born pastor named Henning Jacobson. Took his anti-vaccine crusade, anti-mandate crusade, history, please correct, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The nation's top justices issued a landmark 1905 ruling that legitimized the authority of states to reasonably infringe upon personal freedoms during a public health crisis by issuing a fine to those who refused vaccination. Here is the Certificate of Protection from Smallpox, your old Vax card from 1902. They say a certificate of protection from smallpox filled out by the U.S. Marine Hospital Service for John Donaldson, traveling aboard SS Chalmette to New Orleans, Havana, Cuba, July 18th, 1902. And the question is, how far did the mandates go? Was it mostly for conscription? Let's go through a few of the things Left says. George Washington mandated for... Stop right there. You're talking about conscripted soldiers in the American Revolution being inoculated for smallpox. Smallpox is devastating, pretty bad, and this was just for his soldiers. This wasn't if you'd like to come into the pub, the government has mandated you show your papers. Very different. That may have been the case with smallpox, but let's read. They say in 1901, the city of Boston registered 1,596 cases of confirmed smallpox. Highly contagious, fever-inducing illness infamous for causing a severe rash in the face and arms that often left survivors scarred for life. In Boston alone, 270 people died from smallpox during 1901 to 1903. Jacobson served as a pastor at a Swedish Lutheran church in Cambridge, had been vaccinated against smallpox in Sweden when he was 6 years old, an experience that he later said caused him great and extreme suffering. So when Dr. E. Edwin Spencer, chairman of the Cambridge Board of Health, knocked on the Jacobson's door, the pastor refused vaccination for himself and his son. A few months later, Cambridge was in a full-fledged panic, with the city ordering the closure of schools, libraries, churches, to stem the spread of the disease. Police officers accompanied health officials like Spencer, who went door-to-door vaccinating as many as 100 people a day. But while the Cambridge vaccine order was compulsory, it wasn't a forced vaccination. People like Jacobson who refused to get vaccinated faced a $5 fine, the equivalent of nearly $150 today. On July 17, 1902, Dr. Spencer issued a criminal complaint against Jacobson and other vaccine activists to collect the $5 fine. He went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately sided against him. They rejected Jacobson's argument, but they do mention that Jacobson tried arguing the vaccine was ineffective. The Supreme Court said they weren't going to hear it. Sound familiar? And ultimately, he argued that depriving any... let me read a little bit. The highest court in Massachusetts rejected Jacobson's claims, siding instead with the authority of public health officials to determine the best methods for fighting the epidemic. He was arguing that compulsion to introduce disease into a healthy system is a violation of liberty. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said, in these cases, it has to be reasonable. A reasonable infringement makes sense, especially when there's a public health crisis. Okay, so they were fining people. Is that the same as firing everybody? No. Is it the same as saying you can't come into a restaurant and eat food unless you show us your papers? No. This is the government is going to come collect a fine for you because the Supreme Court said that was reasonable. The Supreme Court rule upon your ability to go out to buy food? No. It gets funnier, though. It gets, not funny is the wrong word. It gets really, really bad. In a far darker chapter, the Jacobson decision provided judicial cover for a Virginia law that authorized the involuntary sterilization of feeble-minded individuals in state mental institutions. In the 1920s, eugenics enjoyed wide support in scientific and medical circles, and the Supreme Court justices were not immune. They say, in the infamous 1927 case Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court accepted the questionable facts presented in the lower court cases that a young Virginia woman named Carrie Bell hailed from a long line of mental defectives, whose offspring were a burden on public welfare. Quote, the principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, wrote Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in a chilling opinion. The Buck decision opened the floodgates, and by 1930, a total of 24 states had passed involuntary sterilization laws, And around 60,000 women were ultimately sterilized under these statutes. Buck v. Bell is the most extreme and barbaric example of the Supreme Court justifying a law in the name of public health. And that's where we can go. But let's talk about the MMR in the schools. Okay, I'm in favor of that. I think if there's a public schooling system and they say to participate in this public institution, which is schools, we have these guidelines based on legislation passed and effectiveness. Now, there are questions about how far you can go with mandating schools versus the rest of the public. But the thing is, public schools aren't the end all be all. And I want to make sure I stress, I'm not 100% behind this. I just lean in favor of, here's my thought, because it is nuanced. If you don't want your kid going to a public school because they have to be vaccinated, homeschool them. Find a way. But if you want someone to take charge of your children, and they said, if your kid doesn't have this vaccine, I'm not going to allow that. I think that I agree with that to a certain degree. The challenge then becomes that poor and working class people who can't afford private schools or homeschooling are left with the, if my child is not undergoing this medical procedure, he can't go to this institution. But I'll put it this way. If you are seeking to receive something from the state and they have a restriction on it, there are some limits. Ultimately, I would say this. It's like a 51 to 49 thing. As I stated in another video, I'm not a big fan, but these are schools, and I am much more in favor of homeschooling and private schooling and of people taking personal responsibility for their families. I'm not a fan of the government taking your tax dollars to fund this program and then mandating kids get vaccinated. I just want more people to be homeschooled. So I'll put it this way. For the time being, I'm kind of like, well, look, we have a lot of vaccines. I'm pro-vaccine. They do work. There are side effects. Long-standing trials over decades and legislation passed to say, okay, public schools, okay, you need to be vaccinated. However, I'm also for voucher systems, meaning that if tax dollars are being taken from people, the voucher should be given to the parents where they can choose to send that kid somewhere else. The voucher system solves the problem. If the public school wants a vaccine, so be it. Now, if they want to mandate for any person anywhere, I'm opposed to that. Now, the Supreme Court did allow it in the 1905 case, but that was just a fine. They were trying to seek the equivalent of $150 from this guy for not doing it, and smallpox was insane, scarring people and killing people. You see the very big difference here? This was not a case of them saying, if you want to go to the bar, you need to prove that you are vaccinated. So, voucher system. Give families vouchers to choose what schools they go to, and then if you want to run your public schools, your schools with vaccine mandates, by all means, go ahead and do it. And the parents can then take their kids out and use that voucher to send them anywhere else. Provide that competition. So where do we go? Noam Chomsky brings up a really good point. There's no solution here. He says isolation. Maybe most people bend the knee and then there's no qualms. But even people who are vaccinated, who have been on Tim Kessler, for instance, have argued that it's wrong and would stand in opposition to this. In which case, maybe national divorce is the only thing that could possibly occur. Noam Chomsky went really far with it. Getting them food? That's their problem. You mean you're going to cut people off from food and say your problem, undergo the medical procedure or else? They didn't do that in 1905. They said, well, you got to pay a fine. $150 equivalent today. For a lot of people, that's a lot. But that could theoretically be 10 hours of work. Okay, fine. I'll work for 10 hours and have to pay a fine. Not a fan of that. Very different from what we're seeing now. You're fired. You can't come into the state. You can't drive a truck. You can't work. Lies from the left. So what's the solution? Well, national divorce, peaceful divorce, civil war, call it whatever you want. It's remarkable that we're at this point. Here we go. Bye-bye, Maryland, saith New York Times. Lawmakers in 3 counties float a plan to secede from the state. The proposal to join West Virginia seems destined to go nowhere, but it has tapped into deep-seated feelings of alienation in Western Maryland, a mountainous panhandle wedged against the Mason-Dixon line. All right, we work there. We're new here. We've been here for a year, got out of the New Jersey area, and boy, was I excited to hear. Now, I personally am a resident of West Virginia. We just have the office in Maryland for a variety of reasons. But we do have a new setup called Fredomistan, which is being built in West Virginia because West Virginia is best Virginia, and it's way better than Western Maryland. But that's only because Eastern Maryland, which is deep blue with Democrats in D.C. and in Baltimore voting for these things. And the people in Western Maryland are just like, yo, we don't live that way. For instance, there's a lot of hunting technically in Western Maryland, but they've got Baltimore laws over your gun rights in a rural area. We had a bear attack. Yeah, a bear tried breaking into the chicken coop. Heaven forbid we need to use firearms to defend ourselves. The laws in Maryland are absolutely insane. In West Virginia, they're not. Not only are there some laws, but they make sense. Maryland's laws make literally no sense. One of the things they mention in this article, these lawmakers say, it's mask mandates. It's vaccine mandates. And I got to be honest, I'm not going to go to Eastern Maryland. We went there. We went and checked out Travis Pastrana's place, because we knew somebody who knew it. And, we checked it out. He's got a skate ramp, skate park, and big, crazy woods and stuff. In Western Maryland, it may as well be West Virginia. And when I talk to locals out here, and we do all the time, every day, they say this is West Virginia for all intents and purposes. If you want to be in West Virginia, literally, it's 1 minute. And you think I'm kidding. It's literally 1 minute. Well, to be honest, it's a minute to Virginia and then another 20 seconds to West Virginia because it's, that's how the tri-state out here works. People are saying they want out. Quote, we believe this arrangement may be mutually beneficial for both states and for our local constituencies. Please advise the next steps. Now, of course, Maryland is saying heavens no. They're saying that we can't allow that. Why? They don't want to lose serfs. You got money to be made out here, even if you disregard, even if you ignore and you oppress the people who live here. West Virginia, on the other hand. West Virginia governor says he would welcome 3 Maryland counties with open arms after GOP legislators ask to join his state. What do I got to do? Have I earned any kind of influence in this area? I don't know. If I did, let's figure out how to actually make something like that happen. That'd be fantastic. We can all here be part of West Virginia. Cross the river or not, it's all good. It will be interesting, though, because where we're at, which is basically the Harper's Ferry area, you have to go through Virginia in order to get to West Virginia. So I guess you'd have to drive up to Shepherdstown and then cross from Maryland into West Virginia directly, which would be funny because, I guess it would just be West Virginia, West Virginia again. Anyway, whatever. It's besides the point. I think it'd be great. It's not national divorce. It's internal realignment. And I think it's a good half measure for now. In the CNN article, they mention Greater Idaho. Rural counties in liberal Oregon vote to join conservative Idaho. And the Greater Idaho state's actually something having to do with California as well. But for the time being, you have parts of Washington and Oregon that are saying they want to join Idaho because their values are more aligned. If these blue cities want to do blue city stuff, let them do it. Which brings me back to what Noam Chomsky was saying. When he says people should have the freedom to isolate, I say, okay, but I don't think you realize what that means. Do people want to just live in big cities? No. You know how I know this? Because where we live is an adventure tourism area. West Virginia has a lot of it. All these big city liberals coming out, going to their liberal bars to go ride their kayaks down the river, to go zip lining and rock climbing and, what else are they doing? High ropes courses, rafting. Yeah, the people from the cities come out here for their fun and adventure because, of course, they like that. Who doesn't? Everybody does. But what do the cities have to offer? To be honest, they have big venues. They've got those big venues, man. But as we already know, right now with the vaccine mandates, there are many people who are saying, not worth it. So what'll happen? Well, I think people will ultimately say, I want to live in the free place. I don't want to live in a city that's got me under a boot where I can't leave my house. I'll go there for events. So this means even people who are vaccinated and don't care about vaccine mandates would probably still prefer not to live in a place where they're under a boot with curfews or otherwise, because they can get all that good freedom and then have access to the cities later on. I think most people in the red areas are going to be like, nah, don't know, don't care. But in the end, if this can't happen, and I got to be honest, I don't think it can. There's that old quote, I think it's from JFK, I could be wrong. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. I think it's a funny phrase, kind of a scary phrase. But the reality is, if in this country, the ideology of Noam Chomsky persists, and the authoritarians say, we will seize your food from you, then there is an inevitability. And it may just be peaceful. But I will take this opportunity to shout out all of my good friends who said, I cannot speak up, Tim, I'll lose my job. And then how will I feed my kids? Okay. I'm going to ask you how you feed your kids after Noam Chomsky isolates you from society and then deprives you of your food and treats you like you're living in some kind of jail situation. Do you think your children will enjoy that life? The freedoms that you give up today are freedoms your children will never know existed. I like to look back at how things used to be, and I'm like, they had a lot of freedoms, and we reasonably walk away from some in exchange for some safety. Now, there's a big question. Smallpox, scary. Would we give up our freedom for safety from smallpox? I don't know. I honestly don't. I think a lot of people would. Airborne Ebola, definitely. So it really is about the severity of the emergency, not so much the merit. But I ultimately come to conclude with the original mandate, a $5 fine equivalent to $150. That's not that bad. It's bad. I'm not a fan. I'm glad this guy went about his business the way he did and filed suit. But what they were saying was everyone's got to do it, and if you don't, we're gonna fine you. I find it fascinating that they were trying to vaccinate against smallpox, which protected everybody from smallpox, but then this one guy who didn't want to do it was a problem. I guess their concern is mutation. Their concern is asymptomatic spread or whatever. But even in this instance, all they said was fine, pay the fine. You can keep going about your daily business. Not right now. And they want to take your food away from you. So I want you to remember that. The next time you decide to say to somebody, feeding my kids is more important than defending my freedoms, I'll just say, all right, well, get in line behind Noam Chomsky. At least you'll have your food. Actually, maybe Noam Chomsky is making that perfect point. Noam Chomsky and the left will deprive you of food unless you get on your knees. So please, if that is the route you want to take, I want you to look your child in the eye right now and tell them to start praying to Lord and Saint Fauci, to learn to drop to their knees and beg to be fed, because that is the future you're building for them. I understand it's difficult. I understand I don't have kids. People say, Tim, you don't have kids. You don't understand. You're right. One thing I do understand, though, is it may be a difficult choice. You may not want to have to do it, and you'd prefer the easy route of making sure your kids are fed. But please, just make sure your kids learn Mandarin and learn to live on their knees. Because if that's really the future you want for them, so be it. I don't believe right now that your children would go without food. We're not at a point where there are gulags in the United States, but we may get there if Noam Chomsky and his followers have anything to say about it. So maybe right now the real solution is move somewhere where you're protected and can feed your kids and you don't have to live on your knees. I'm surprised by this, really. It is kind of the most shocking thing ever to hear someone say, I want my children to know a life living on their knees. Yeah. All right. It's all you then. We'll see how that plays out. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimcastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.